Defense Secretary Mark Esper said Wednesday he opposes using the U.S. military to quiet domestic unrest in a break with President Donald Trump, who has threatened to deploy federal troops to dominate the streets.
I say this not only as Secretary of Defense, but also as a former soldier, and a former member of the National Guard. The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort, and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now, he said.
I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
Two administration officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, said Trump was angry with Esper's comments and felt like the defense secretary left the impression it was his decision on whether to invoke the Insurrection Act.
Asked whether Trump had lost confidence in Esper, Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany told reporters, "As of right now, Secretary Esper is still Secretary Esper. Trump will let the public know if he loses faith in Esper," she said.
The Insurrection Act is an 1807 law that allows the president to dispatch the military or federalize the National Guard in states that are unable to put down an insurrection or are defying federal law. The act has been invoked in the past to confront the Ku Klux Klan during Reconstruction and to enforce desegregation in the South. And former President George H. W. Bush used it in 1992 to help California's governor respond to riots in Los Angeles.
Protests have roiled cities across the U.S. following the death of George Floyd, an African-American man who suffocated last week after a Minneapolis police officer pinned him to the ground.
Trump has bemoaned Governor's weak response to the unrest, and on Monday he told reporters in the Rose Garden he would deploy federal forces where local authorities were not able to stop violent protests themselves.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them, Trump said.
Law and Order, Trump returns to 2016 theme as violence spreads after George Floyd death.
More, D.C. Mayor Bowser vows to push back on increasing federal presence in George Floyd protests.
While Trump has the legal authority to invoke the Insurrection Act, many, like Esper, caution against the use of troops to quiet domestic unrest.
No level-headed governor is asking for an even more militarized response to civilian protests against police brutality and systemic racism, for good reason, said ACLU National Security Project Director Hina Shamsi.
Michelle Flournoy, who served as Under-Secretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, said previous presidents have understood the extreme sensitivity of using the U.S. military against American citizens or in confronting American citizens.
Esper said the National Guard is best suited for domestic situations in support of local law enforcement.
After Trump's Rose Garden news briefing on Monday, Esper and other administration officials accompanied the president on a controversial walk from the White House to a nearby church after protesters were forcefully cleared from the area.
Esper told reporters Wednesday he knew the president planned to take him and other administration officials to the St. John's Episcopal Church. But he said he did not know the president planned to walk there to pose with a Bible or that the protesters were being driven out.
I did know that we were going to church, I was not aware that a photo op was happening, Esper said.
He said he believed the group was going to review the damage demonstrators had caused the day before in Lafayette Square and at St. John's.
What I was not aware of was exactly where we were going, when we arrived at the church and what the plans were once we got there, Esper said. He told reporters he wanted to clarify remarks he made to NBC News the night before, which implied he did not know they would be going to the church.
Historic Church, St. John's Church has intersected with Donald Trump at key moments of his presidency.
Esper said he and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley thought they would have been able to thank members of the National Guard for their service during the walk, but the path we took to and from the church didn't afford us that opportunity.
When asked if he knew National Park Police would use strong measures to drive out peaceful protesters, Esper said he was not aware of what they were doing.
I was not aware of law enforcement plans for the park. I was not briefed on them, nor should I expect to be, Esper said. But they had to take what actions I assume they felt was necessary, given what they faced.
Esper said he was on his way to the White House when the area was cleared of protesters.
That was not a military decision. It was not a military action. The National Guard was there in support of law enforcement, he said.
William Barr, Attorney General, ordered parked protesters cleared before Trump's visit to St. John's Church.
Esper and Milley were sharply criticized for their participation in the event. James Miller, a member of the Pentagon's Defense Science Board, resigned in response to the incident, telling Esper he violated his oath to defend the Constitution.
You may not have been able to stop President Trump from directing this appalling use of force, but you could have chosen to oppose it. Instead, you visibly supported it, James wrote in his resignation letter.
The Defense Secretary addressed some of the criticisms the Pentagon has faced during Wednesday's news conference.
Esper said National Guard members did not fire rubber bullets or tear gas into the crowd, though he did not address whether other security forces may have. And he said the guardsmen wore helmets and body armor for their protection, not to serve as some form of intimidation.
Tear gas versus pepper spray, debate over methods used to clear Lafayette Square turns political.
He confirmed a National Guard medevac helicopter hovered low over the protesters and said he had directed Secretary of the Army Ryan McCarthy to conduct an inquiry into what happened.
I want to make sure I understand why, he said. Who was involved, and what orders they were given or not given. Esper contested the idea that the hovering helicopter was used to intimidate protesters but said flying that low in a city looks unsafe to me.
There's a lot of questions that need to be answered, he said.
Esper also acknowledged he had advised Minnesota Governor Tim Walz that the best way to stop the violent protests was by dominating the battle space. Critics said the phrase implied the protesting citizens were enemy combatants, but Esper said it was a commonly used phrase from the military lexicon to describe a bounded area of operations.
It's not a phrase focused on people, and certainly not on our fellow Americans, Esper said. In retrospect, I would use different wording, so as not to distract from the more important matters at hand or allow some to suggest that we're militarizing the issue.
The Secretary of Defense said the military is sworn to defend the First Amendment right to free assembly and we encourage Americans at all times to exercise them peacefully.
He said Floyd's death was a murder and a horrible crime, but he had refrained from commenting on it sooner because he wanted to stay out of the political fray.
My aim is to keep the department out of politics, to stay apolitical, he said.
For well over 2 centuries, the United States military has earned the respect of the American people by being there to protect and serve all Americans, he said. We will safeguard the hard-earned trust and confidence of the public as our nation's most respected institution.
Contributing, Michael Collins, David Jackson and the Associated Press.
Minnesota, National Guard plans to deploy as many as 10,000 soldiers to Minneapolis protests.